Picture this. You are a paleoanthropologist, and you have just found a hominin skull at an excavation site in South Africa. It is approximately 2 million years old, which is already extraordinary. But as you clean the sediment from around it with careful brushes, you notice something that makes your hands go still. Two circular holes in the bone, symmetrically placed, roughly the diameter of large canine teeth, positioned in exactly the pattern that a leopard's lower jaw would produce when biting through a skull to carry it. This skull was not buried here, it was dropped here. Something carried it in its mouth, probably into a tree or a cave, and the skull fell and settled into the sediment that eventually became the rock you're now excavating. The individual this skull belonged to, a small-brained bipedal hominin who walked upright through the South African landscape 2 million years ago, was not the predator in that encounter. They were the prey. The skull in question, known as SK54 and associated with Paranthropus robustus, was one of the first direct fossil evidence for predation on early hominins, and it established something that popular accounts of human evolution often gloss over uncomfortably. For most of the time that human ancestors have existed, they were not at the top of the food chain. They were in the middle of it. They were prey animals, relatively defenseless, relatively slow by predator standards, walking upright in environments saturated with animals that ate things for a living. So which animals actually killed the most ancient humans? The answer is more diverse, more quantifiable in some respects, and more surprising in others than most people have considered. The question requires some framing before diving into the candidates, because ancient humans spans an enormous temporal range with very different ecological contexts. Australopithecines and early Homo living in Africa between roughly 4 million and 1 million years ago faced a predator guild that was, by modern standards, extraordinarily diverse and dangerous. The Pliocene and early Pleistocene African megafauna included not just the large predators familiar from modern Africa, lions, leopards, hyenas, but also extinct species that were substantially larger and more formidable than their surviving relatives. Saber-toothed cats, giant hyenas, bear-sized hunting cats, and predatory mammals with no living equivalents all inhabited the same landscapes as early hominins. Later Homo species, Homo erectus, Homo heidelbergensis, Neanderthals, and early Homo sapiens faced progressively reduced predator diversity as the megafaunal extinctions of the Pleistocene proceeded, but remained in danger from the surviving large predators, and from entirely different categories of killer that didn't make dramatic kills but accumulated body counts over time through disease and accumulated injury. The categories of animal killer also require separation. Direct predation, an animal attacking and consuming a human, is the most viscerally dramatic category, but may not have been the numerically largest killer. Indirect killing through disease vectors, insects transmitting pathogens that killed far more than any direct predator, probably accumulated far higher total mortality across human evolutionary history. Defensive killing, animals striking in self-defense rather than predatory pursuit, represents another significant category. Understanding which animals killed the most ancient humans requires attending to all of these. Start with the predators, because they are the most archaeologically visible killers and the ones that shaped ancient human behavior most profoundly. The leopard almost certainly killed more early hominins than any other large cat and possibly more than any other large predator, and the evidence for this is both direct and ecological. The skull with the leopard tooth holes was not an isolated discovery. Multiple hominin fossils from South African cave sites, Australopithecus africanus, Paranthropus robustus, early Homo, show toothmark patterns and skeletal damage consistent with leopard predation. Accumulation analysis of these cave sites suggests that leopards were using the caves as dens and lairs, dragging prey, including hominins, into them for consumption. The leopard's ecological characteristics made it a particularly dangerous predator for early hominins. Leopards are ambush hunters. They stalk close, attack by surprise, and target the nape of the neck or the skull with their killing bite. This hunting method is devastatingly effective against prey that relies on visual detection of threats rather than on speed or armor for defense. Early hominins moving through woodland and forest edge environments that provided the same cover that leopards exploit for stalking were well-suited prey profiles, large enough to be worth targeting, insufficiently armed or armored to pose serious danger to an attacking leopard, and lacking the herd behavior that makes attacking large prey groups more costly for ambush predators. Leopards also specifically hunt primates, including modern baboons, chimpanzees, and other large primates, and the behavioral adaptations of modern great apes to leopard threat, including alarm calling, mobbing behavior, and refuge in trees, suggest deep evolutionary exposure to leopard predation pressure. The same leopard-adapted alarm behaviors in modern chimpanzees were almost certainly present in the ancestral hominin lineage, reflecting millions of years of leopard-hominin interaction that was frequently fatal for the hominins. The density of leopard-caused hominin deaths is impossible to quantify with precision, but the archaeological signature is sufficiently consistent across multiple sites and time periods that leopards were almost certainly the most significant direct predator of early hominins across the African woodland and forest edge environments where Australopithecines and early Homo species evolved. The spotted hyena requires separate examination from the leopard because its relationship with early hominins was different in character while being comparable in consequence. Spotted hyenas are not scavengers who occasionally hunt. This is the persistent popular misconception. They are highly successful pack predators who frequently scavenge as an opportunistic supplement to their hunting, not the reverse. A clan of spotted hyenas is among the most formidable predator assemblages in any ecosystem, capable of taking prey up to the size of adult wildebeest or zebra through coordinated pursuit that exhausts prey animals over distance. Their bite force is the highest of any large African carnivore, capable of crushing through bone that lions cannot process. And their social coordination is sophisticated enough to support deliberate strategic cooperation during hunts. For early hominins moving in small groups through open grassland and woodland savanna, a hyena clan represented a significant and constant threat. Hyenas are primarily active at night, and during dusk and dawn, precisely the periods when early hominins, relying on daylight for visual detection of threats, were most vulnerable. A small hominin group camping on open ground without adequate fire would have been vulnerable to hyena predation in ways that are difficult to fully appreciate from the safety of modern existence. The fossil evidence for hyena-hominin interaction is abundant. Hyena tooth marks on hominin bones from South African cave sites, the accumulated hominin remains in ancient hyena dens, and the general pattern of bone damage consistent with hyena processing all indicate that hyenas were regular consumers of hominin remains, whether through direct predation or through scavenging of individuals killed by other means or by disease. Distinguishing direct predation from scavenging in the fossil record is methodologically difficult, but the accumulation of hominin material in what appear to be hyena den contexts is consistent with hominins being regular prey items rather than occasional scavenging opportunities. The extinct giant hyena Pachyrhocutta brevirostris, a hyena substantially larger than any modern species, estimated at the size of a large lion and with correspondingly more powerful bite force, occupied African and Eurasian environments during the early Pleistocene, when early Homo species were diversifying and dispersing. Pachyrhocutta was a bone crusher, capable of processing large carcasses entirely, and it was present in the same environments as early Homo erectus during the initial expansion of our genus across Africa and into Eurasia. The competitive and predatory interactions between Pachyrhocutta and early Homo were almost certainly consequential for both populations, though the specifics are lost in the fragmentary fossil record. The extinct saber-toothed cat Dinofelis deserves particular attention in any account of ancient human predation, because it appears, based on fossil site analysis, to have had an unusually high overlap in prey, targeting with early hominins. Dinofelis was a medium-large feliid, smaller than a modern lion, but substantially larger than a modern leopard, with false saber teeth intermediate in length between modern big cats and the more extreme saber-toothed development of Smilodon. It was present in African environments from approximately 5 million to 1 million years ago, precisely overlapping with the temporal range of Australopithecines and early Homo. Analysis of the prey remains associated with Dinofelis at South African cave sites, including the infamous Swartkrans and Sterkfontein deposits, shows a striking concentration of primate remains, including hominins, compared to the prey assemblages of other contemporary predators. Some researchers have proposed that Dinofelis was a primate specialist. By the way, if you want to go even deeper into the secret lives of ancient humans, I just launched a full course called The Secret Lives of Ancient Humans. 10 modules, 3+ hours of content covering everything we never talk about on YouTube. What they feared, how they communicated, what hunted them, and much more. Plus an exclusive PDF guide included. Link in the description. See you inside. A predator that had developed behavioral and anatomical adaptations for hunting the abundant and relatively accessible primates of the African woodland environments. If this interpretation is correct, early hominins were not incidentally killed by Dinofelis as occasional prey. They were a primary target, representing a central component of Dinofelis' dietary strategy. The false saber teeth of Dinofelis, while shorter than those of Smilodon, were still substantially longer than those of modern big cats and were likely adapted for a killing bite to the skull or neck of prey. The hominin skull, with its relatively thin bone protecting a large, soft tissue brain, would have been an accessible target for a bite of this configuration. The combination of leopard-like ambush hunting with skull-targeting killing bite and apparent primate dietary preference makes Dinofelis a particularly significant predator in the early hominin story. Crocodilians are the predator that most consistently underperforms in popular accounts of ancient human mortality, while almost certainly representing one of the most significant long-term killers of hominins and early humans across Africa and eventually Asia. Modern Nile crocodiles kill more people in Africa than lions and leopards combined, primarily because they occupy the water sources that human populations must access for survival. Ancient hominins living in the lake margin, river valley, and wetland environments that characterize many of the richest early human sites in Africa, Olduvai Gorge, the Omo Valley, the shores of ancient Lake Turkana, were in constant proximity to water environments that supported large crocodilian populations. Ancient crocodilian diversity was greater than modern diversity, and several species were substantially larger than the largest modern Nile crocodiles. Crocodilus thorbjarnarsoni, an extinct giant crocodile estimated at approximately 7 to 8 meters in length, substantially longer than any modern crocodilian, coexisted with Homo habilis and early Homo erectus around Lake Turkana approximately 2 million years ago. At that size, C. thorbjarnarsoni was capable of taking prey up to the size of large bovids, and a bipedal hominin approaching the water's edge represented an entirely accessible prey item. The fossil record from early hominin sites frequently includes crocodile remains alongside hominin material, and there is direct fossil evidence of crocodile predation on hominins in several instances. The concentration of early human and hominin activity around permanent water sources, for drinking, for plant food availability, for hunting opportunities, at drinking locations, placed them in constant proximity to the most dangerous aquatic predators in their environment. The cumulative mortality from crocodile predation over millions of years of this proximity was almost certainly substantial, even if each individual event left no durable archaeological trace. Mosquitoes occupy a different category from the direct predators, but almost certainly represent the deadliest category of animal killer across the full span of human evolutionary history, and their absence from popular discussions of what killed ancient humans reflects a bias toward dramatic visible killers rather than accurate accounting of mortality. Plasmodium falciparum, the most lethal malaria parasite, is estimated to have killed more human beings than any other single disease. Agent in history. It was not present in modern humans from the beginning. The strain responsible for most malaria mortality underwent an evolutionary bottleneck and expansion at some point during the last 100,000 years or so, and its relationship with Anopheles mosquito vectors makes it specifically a tropical and subtropical pathogen. But across the span of human habitation of Africa and tropical Asia, malaria delivered through Anopheles mosquitoes has been a consistent and devastating cause of mortality. The genetic evidence for the antiquity and intensity of malaria selection on human populations is clear. The prevalence of sickle cell trait in populations with long histories of malaria exposure and the frequency of other hemoglobin variants that confer malaria resistance demonstrates that selection pressure from malaria has been intense enough and sustained enough to drive significant changes in population allele frequencies over human evolutionary timescales. Selection pressure of this magnitude implies that malaria was killing people at rates sufficient to substantially influence reproductive fitness. Rates that, in absolute terms across millions of people over hundreds of thousands of years, produce staggering total mortality numbers. Other mosquito-transmitted diseases, dengue, yellow fever, various encephalitides, added additional mortality in tropical environments, though none approached the scale of malaria. The mosquito's status as the deadliest animal in the modern world, responsible for more human deaths than any vertebrate predator, reflects not a recent development, but the continuation of a role it has played throughout human history in tropical environments. Venomous snakes represent a direct kill category that is archaeologically almost completely invisible, but that was almost certainly a consistent source of mortality across all of human evolutionary history in virtually every inhabited environment. Snakes appear in every terrestrial environment on Earth outside of Arctic and Antarctic conditions, and venomous species are abundantly represented in the African, Asian, and eventually European environments that ancient humans inhabited. The puff adder in Africa, the saw-scaled viper across Africa and Asia, the Russell's viper across South and Southeast Asia, the coastal taipan and eastern brown snake in Australia. These are among the most lethal snake species in the world, and all of them inhabit environments that ancient humans colonized. Snake bites kill through venom mechanisms that are rapid and, in the absence of any antivenom or effective supportive treatment, often fatal. In modern populations in tropical and subtropical regions without access to antivenom, snakebite case fatality rates for bites from the most dangerous species can approach 100% for severe envenomations. Ancient humans with no medical intervention of any kind beyond whatever folk remedies accumulated in their cultural knowledge, most of which had little or no efficacy against venom toxicity, would have faced similar case fatality rates for bites from highly venomous species. The evolutionary evidence for sustained snake predation pressure on the primate lineage is visible in the specific neural architecture of primate visual systems. Primate brains contain dedicated snake detection circuitry, specific neural pathways that respond to snake-like visual patterns with heightened arousal and attention, suggesting that snake encounters have been sufficiently frequent and dangerous throughout primate evolutionary history to drive the evolution of specialized threat detection mechanisms. This neural specialization was almost certainly adaptive, but its existence implies that the threat it protects against was real and persistent enough to constitute genuine selection pressure across the evolutionary history of the primate lineage. Large herbivores are the predator category most counterintuitive in a list of ancient human killers, but defensive attacks by large herbivores almost certainly produced significant human mortality across the time spans when ancient humans were hunting and living alongside these animals. Modern statistics on large animal injuries and fatalities in Africa showed that hippos, buffalo, and elephants kill more people annually than lions do. These deaths are not predatory. The animals are not hunting or eating the people they kill. They are defending themselves, defending offspring, or reacting aggressively to perceived threat. The distinction matters for how we classify the kills, but not for the dead people. Ancient humans attempting to hunt, approach, or simply navigate through environments occupied by large aggressive herbivores were at constant risk of defensive attack. A charging African buffalo, an animal weighing approximately 750 kilograms capable of running at 55 kilometers per hour, is one of the most dangerous animals in any African landscape, and its defensive aggression is notoriously unpredictable. An ancient human hunting buffalo with spears would have been operating in a context where defensive charging by the target animal was a regular and potentially fatal risk. The extinct large herbivores of the Pleistocene, giant buffalo species, primitive rhinoceroses of substantially larger size than modern species, straight-tusked elephants present across Eurasia during warm intervals, would have added additional large-bodied defensive threats to the environments ancient humans inhabited. Hunting these animals with the weapons available, thrusting spears initially, then thrown spears and eventually atlatl-launched darts, brought hunters into ranges where defensive attacks were possible and where the size differential between hunter and hunted was extreme enough that contact frequently resulted in fatal injuries. The healed and unhealed trauma visible in the skeletal remains of Neanderthals is instructive here. Analyses of Neanderthal skeletal trauma have found injury patterns consistent with high rates of contact injuries. Broken ribs, healed fractures, head trauma, at frequencies that are comparable to modern professional rodeo riders who engage in regular close contact work with large, unpredictable animals. The comparison is deliberate and illuminating. Neanderthal injury patterns suggest a lifestyle of frequent, close-range engagement with large animals that produced regular significant injuries, some of which proved fatal. The shift in which animals were most dangerous to humans across evolutionary time is itself one of the most revealing patterns in the entire account of ancient human mortality. In the earliest period, Australopithecines and early Homo before roughly 1 million years ago, direct predation by large cats and hyenids was almost certainly the primary source of animal-caused mortality. Early hominins were small, relatively undefended, moving in small groups through environments saturated with apex predators. The fossil evidence for predation on these populations is substantial, and the behavioral signatures of predator avoidance are written into the biology of surviving primates. As Homo erectus and later species developed more sophisticated weapons, larger social groups, and eventually fire, the calculus of direct predation shifted. Large cats and hyenas remained dangerous, but the risk management that came from coordinated group defense, fire maintenance at camps, and increasingly effective weapons reduced the per capita mortality from direct predation. The apex predators were still there, and still killing people, but less frequently as a proportion of total mortality. Simultaneously, as human populations expanded into new environments and as agricultural and settled living created new vectors for disease transmission, pathogen vectoring animals, particularly mosquitoes, but also ticks, fleas, and other blood-feeding insects, became increasingly dominant as sources of mortality. The disease burden of settled agricultural communities was substantially higher than that of mobile hunter-gatherer groups, and the insect vectors of those diseases killed far more people than any direct predator. By the time of early modern Homo sapiens expanding across the world in the late Pleistocene, the most dangerous animal most humans faced was almost certainly not a large cat or a crocodile, but a mosquito carrying malaria, or a tick carrying a bacterial infection, or a flea carrying plague in the agricultural communities that were beginning to develop in some regions. The practical implication of all this ancient mortality, the cumulative effect of millions of years of predation pressure, pathogen vectors, and large animal encounters, is visible in modern human biology and behavior in ways that most people never explicitly connect to their evolutionary origins. The fear of snakes and spiders that is disproportionately prevalent in human populations worldwide, present even in people who have never encountered either animal in real life and who live in environments where neither poses any practical threat, reflects the deep history of snake and venomous arthropod predation pressure across the primate lineage. This fear is not learned from cultural exposure in most cases. It appears to be a prepared fear, a phobia for which humans are biologically predisposed, because the threat that drove its evolution was real and persistent enough to shape the neurology of threat response across millions of years. The hypervigilance that characterizes human threat detection systems, the tendency to see faces and threats in ambiguous stimuli, the startle response, the elevated arousal that comes with darkness, reflects the specific predator ecology of the environments in which these systems were shaped. The darkness that ancient hominins feared was not metaphorically dark. It was the darkness in which leopards hunted, in which hyenas were most active, in which crocodiles at the water's edge were least visible. The animals that killed the most ancient humans are gone from most modern environments, or reduced to shadows of their former abundance and range. But the memory of them, written not in any cultural transmission, but in the biology of threat response, fear conditioning, sleep behavior, and group vigilance, persists in the bodies of every person alive. The skull with the tooth holes in it was found decades ago. The leopard that made them died 2 million years before that. But the neurological architecture those encounters helped shape is still running. Right now, in the brain of everyone who finds the darkness slightly more uncomfortable than the light, that is what it means to have been prey. Not once, for millions of years.